So movement for this week is going to be the hip thrust, specifically the barbell hip thrust. Machines, they're a little bit different, but we're going to go with barbell this week. And hip thrust, I'm pretty sure, are movement everybody is familiar with at this point, but it is still, unfortunately, something I see done incorrectly, a little bit wrong, which if you do it a little bit wrong, you're actually missing a lot of the benefit of a hip thrust. So we're going to kind of break that down, go over it a little bit today with some progressions and regressions. So hip thrust, we're going to go ahead and talk about it. First thing is make sure that you have a pad, all right? So it seems a little bit, I don't know, subtle, not like a big deal, but having a pad for hip thrust is actually a really, really, really important thing, because if you are so worried about the discomfort that you're feeling in your hips, you're not actually gonna be able to push load, push intensity whenever you're doing the movement. So make sure you have something, find a comfortable position on your hips, have it padded. That's step number one. Step number two, make sure that whatever you're actually doing the hip thrust against is stable and secure. You don't want to be actually performing the movement and be sliding back at the same time and push yourself out of a good position. So right now we have this up against the post. It's not gonna move, it's pretty secure, so we should be good there as well. So then we're gonna actually get into our position, make sure the pad is good, roll it up into the hips. So from this point, I'm a little bit bigger than most people who are gonna be doing like a barbell hip thrust, so it's a little bit wonky for me to get in position, so I kind of pull my feet up. You can see it's just already kind of pulling the bar. From here, I like to leverage my upper arms on the box or the bench, whatever we're using, and pull myself up into position. Then kind of walk myself back, make sure I'm secure. From here, we're going to just bridge up, lock out, and perform the movement that way. So here, nice and controlled, powerful concentric, up and back down. Very simple, right? So everybody knows how to do a hip thrust, I'm pretty sure. Now we can talk about some of the really common mistakes that I see that unfortunately start to really pull a lot of the benefit out of the movement. So first big thing is actually gonna be feet position, all right? So if your feet are too far away, you're gonna be missing a lot of the actual range of motion that you'd be getting. If your feet are too close, you're gonna be getting too much quad in the movement, too much knee flexion at the bottom. So you want them just right so that whenever you're at the top of the thrust, your knees are at a 90-degree angle. They should be at 90 degrees whenever you're in lockout and extended. So here, again, walk yourself up. If your feet are too far out here like this, it's gonna be a lot more hamstrings and glutes. So here, I'm really limited, but look at where my knee angle is at the top, beyond 90 degrees. Vice versa, climb back here, knee angle, very, very extreme here. Whenever I bridge up, I'm gonna get a lot more quads than glutes. So here, I have a steep angle through my knee. It's not what we want. Remember, 90 degrees at the top here, bridge up there. So, all right, so next biggest mistake I see is delving into hyperextensions and dipping too far into that extension pattern at the top whenever you're trying to lock out. A lot of people will struggle with this because they're just going too heavy with the movement. Some people actually don't really have that full hip extension, whether it's due to tight hip flexors, tight quads, whatever it might be. But either way, you want to make sure that your pelvis is neutral at the top and you're getting full hip extension, not pulling it from your low back and not going into that hyperextension pattern. So it might be a little bit difficult to see, but whenever you're here, if you're leading like this with that big arch in your low back, it's going to be problematic and you're not going to get the most out of your glutes. So if you're here, I'm trying to extend like that, you can see I'm leading with my abdomen versus here, keeping my pelvis tucked, keeping my hips neutral, and extending up like that. There's a big difference between this and this whenever it comes to glute recruitment. And then another really big mistake that I see is just not having the box or bench, whatever you're using, in the right position on your back. So whenever we're up in that position, we actually want the edge to be right under our shoulder blades, because that gives us the best position and the best leverage to be able to bridge up without it pushing us into hyperextension. So if we're too far down, as we come down through the movement, it's actually gonna want to push us into that extended position through our spine, rather than being in this position here where it's right under our shoulder blades. And we can actually use it as a fulcrum to pivot around, which is what we want. We want stability, we want that pivot, but we don't want it to compromise our positioning like it would be here. Vice versa, if it's too high up on our trap, we're not gonna get enough stability and enough actual support from the box. So if it's here, again, you see where it is on my trap, I'm not getting enough of the support from the box and bench to be stable, to be able to actually push with a lot of confidence here. All right, so just real quick, what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna go through what everything looks like without the bar, because it's often really hard to see what exactly is going on whenever you have the bar on your lap. So from the perspective of a body weight hip thrust, let's go through each common mistake once more and just show what that looks like. So, feet too far out. Feet too close. Hyperextended low back. And then mismatched support levels here on the low back. So here is low back, too far down. Actually pushing me into hyperextension. And then now too far up on my traps, not enough support. And now, perfect hip thrust is right here. Stable pelvis. Good back support, feet, good distance here. Ending that full lockout. Okay, so easy regression from barbell hip thrust is going to be a feet elevated hip thrust. So this might not actually seem like a regression because you're getting more range of motion, but it is in the sense that it's unloaded. You're just gonna do this with body weight in most cases, but you're gonna be able to really feel your glutes because you're getting that more range of motion. And also, if you're having a lot of trouble getting into that full lockout position, having your shoulders and your feet on the same level will be a little bit easier because you're not gonna be finishing against gravity, you're actually gonna be finishing at an angle. So that change in vectors is gonna be helpful for actually getting that full hip extension. So I will show you what that looks like, but first, it is important to see the setup. So similar height, if not the same height, is gonna be really important here. And also, to make sure that both sides are stable. So we have the post stairs as a backstop. Here, we also have this kettlebell to prevent us from sliding it out. So, whenever we're setting this up, you don't want to have your feet on top of the box. If they're on top of the box, what you're gonna do is you're gonna drive your heels down, and that's going to activate your hamstring because you're basically going to be doing a quasi hamstring curl against the box. Not what we want, all right? So what we do want is we want same setup on the back as normal hip thrust. We want our feet against the edge of the box or bench whenever we're using here. So then we can actually drive into it rather than down against it. And at the top of the movement, we'll be able to push it out that way, in essence, and really flex our glutes, all right? So here, what that's gonna look like, same position, stable and neutral pelvis, here. But we're getting more range of motion at the bottom and finishing at that angle. You kind of think of this like a hip thrust, glute bridge combo, but it actually allows for really strong glute contraction, which is a nice little regression from a barbell hip thrust because you can actually feel the movement working much, much better and kind of circumvent some of those prerequisites that a barbell hip thrust actually has. So regression number 2 is going to be the kneeling squat or kneeling hip thrust, whatever you want to call it. So this can be done cables, bands. I've seen people do it on reverse hypers actually. You can get kind of creative with it. But the feature here is that you're actually going to be in a kneeling position with your calves and your hamstrings in contact, something around your waist to actually be pulling you into that hip flexion here. And I often like to have something on the other end where I can pull myself and anchor myself for that like bracing. But this is essentially going to be a vertical hip thrust. You can think of it like that. You can think of it as that modified hybrid squat pattern where you're gonna get hip extension and also some knee extension as well. But this is meant to be much more glute than it is quad. So here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna extend up against the band. So here, up against the band. So you'll note that my toes are actually pushed into the floor here. You don't want to go plantar flexed. You're not going to get any stability. So you actually have to be up on the balls of your toes. It might be a little bit uncomfortable at first. You'll get used to it though, it's all right. It's not meant to be the most comfortable thing in the world. Also, if you have a band, make sure that you're anchoring it here. Adjust the band tension to where you're actually really resisted in lockout. You want to actually feel that tension as you're extending out here. So again, you're gonna sit back into the tension, into the resistance, and then extend up and push your hips forward. So here, extend. You should really be able to feel your glutes contracting and posteriorly tilt your pelvis under to contract hard. So, first progression that we're gonna run through is gonna be just a dead stop hip thrust. So, whenever I say dead stop, all I mean there is that you're gonna allow the load to settle on the floor or on blocks, whatever the in range of motion is. You can perform this technique for a lot of movements, but for the hip thrust, it's especially effective because you can actually really leverage the powerful concentric portion of the rep. So here, it is important though to make sure that the stop, the in range of motion, is whatever your natural in range is. So if you can't actually reach the floor, use blocks. Raise the plates up a little bit. You don't want to actually reach for the floor to where it compromises your range of motion or your just normal pattern. So here, I can actually reach the floor. So we're gonna go normal setup, normal execution, except for pausing, explosive concentric, so next progression is going to be B stance hip thrust. I like single leg movements, but single leg hip thrusts or glute bridges are really difficult because there's the instability component. You often find yourself kind of falling over to one side. It's hard to actually maintain that neutral pelvis. What we're gonna do here is we're gonna go B stance. So B stance is kind of, you can think of it as a kickstand movement. You're gonna have one foot that's the primary mover. The other foot is gonna act as a stabilizer essentially. So we're gonna have the setup here. So normal position on the back. What we're gonna do is we're gonna have, my right leg is going to be the prime mover. My left leg is gonna be a stabilizer here. So here, stabilizer, you wanna make sure that your hips are still square and level. And bridge up. So you're still gonna be working really hard with that stabilizer side, but the primary mover is taking the majority of that load. So in essence, it's a unilateral movement with a bilateral assist. But this movement is pretty damn difficult, not only just because of the stability component, the coordination that you have to kind of undergo and handle, but also because you have to perform it on both sides, which sucks twice as much, as we all know. So going ahead and wrapping up our breakdown of the hip thrusts. So I do want to go ahead and just make a couple of just, addendums here to the whole breakdown. Has nothing really to do with the actual movement or the progressions or regressions of it or mistakes or anything like that. Just a quick note that I actually really do like hip thrusts. I think that they have become somewhat polarizing in the industry, mostly because on one camp or one side, you have people that are staunchly pro hip thrust who think that you can't grow glutes without implementing hip thrust 3 to 4 times a week. You have other people who probably are mostly annoyed with the pro hip thrust people that are on the other side of the spectrum, where they say that hip thrusts are a completely useless movement. There's no point to doing them. You can get everything that you need for glute growth out of RDLs and squats and things like that, which isn't technically wrong. So this is the point that I want to make, is that you can grow your glutes very well with things like squat patterns, leg presses, hinges, unilateral movements like walking lunges, any kind of abduction or isolation, kickback, hip extension movement. You can get a lot of glute growth out of just refining those relatively simplistic movements. But what hip thrusts specifically do are they actually take you through a loading pattern that is a bit more novel that you don't get with the other movement patterns. So that is going to be loaded horizontal hip extension. So typically, we're able to train our glutes relatively easily and well through lengthened positions. So think about what's going on with squats at the bottom of a squat. Your glutes are fully lengthened. Same thing with an RDL or a deadlift pattern. Glutes are fully lengthened at the bottom. You're not actually getting tension at the top whenever you lock out, whenever the glutes are fully shortened. So inverting that, that's actually what hip thrusts are meant to do. Hip thrusts are meant to overload that lockout, that shortened hip extension portion of the thrust, and you're getting an even loading pattern through that. So that is where I think that hip thrusts actually kind of, make their name and get a really positive rap, is because they are actually training a portion of the glutes that aren't typically hit with other movements. But again, caveat here, I will say that I don't think that hip thrusts are necessary. I think that you can get really, really great glute growth from never doing a single hip thrust in your life. But what I will say is that especially whenever it comes to any kind of physique female athlete, so someone who is training to be on stage, a competitor who really wants to bring up their glutes without necessarily bringing up their entire posterior chain or even their legs, hip thrusts are phenomenal because hip thrusts don't train the hamstrings or quads nearly as much as squats and hinge patterns do. Additionally, hip thrusts are not axial loaded. So you can get a massive volume of hip thrusting in without putting a lot of pressure and stress on your spine, which again is different from a squat or a deadlift hinging pattern. So that is actually where I think that you get the most benefit, is you get the most benefit from being able to add in more volume per unit without overly taxing the system, which is why I think that hip thrusts are actually extremely beneficial when used properly, not relied on completely, right? So you don't need to do hip thrusts as your only glute movement. It shouldn't be variations of hip thrusts for 4 to 5 different times over within a single workout, and that's your whole training session. No, that's not what it is. Hip thrusts and any kind of bridge pattern like that are meant to be complementary, in my opinion, but they do have a massive value in the sense that you can do them more frequently with more volume and distribute them over a training week much more evenly than something, say, like a hinge or a squat pattern. So that is where I think that hip thrusts actually have a massive place in actually trying to grow your glutes. You can add them in really seamlessly. Now we have machine hip thrusts that allow us to take advantage of that even more, kind of get over the limitations of barbell hip thrusts. But I program hip thrusts for a lot of my clients, especially all of my female clients. And again, that's not because I'm married to the movement or I think it's some savior. It's because I see the benefits of being able to do more volume without taxing the entire system. And that's where I truly think that hip thrusts have a lasting place in any kind of glute specific or glute prioritized training program.